Good evening. Welcome to our Gita session this Wednesday evening. So this Wednesday evening, July 19th, we're on the 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. We'll begin with our invocation mantras. If you know them, please chant with me. If not, please meditate on the teacher or teachers that have inspired you on your journey, on your path. Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Jena Tasmai Sri Guruve Namaha Sri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Tadati Swapadantigam Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Namaste Shunyavadi Pastita Deshatarine Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Welcome everybody. So nice to have your association again this evening for our Bhagavad Gita discussion. And we are continuing our discussion in the 9th chapter, a very wonderful chapter. It's the essence of Gita and Lord Krishna's message in Gita. We discussed how, in terms of Krishna delivering the message in particular ways, he has 5 levels of instruction. I said this before, but it's good repeating it because we can talk about the level of instruction that we're now getting to, which is the 5th level. There are general instructions for everyone. Destruction of family if women are not protected. Or one should neither sleep too little or sleep too much. So these are some of the quintessential instructions for general humanity, that women hold such an important position in Vedic culture as mother, as spouse, as creative thinkers, as participants in all types of aspects of society. They are such an important aspect in Vedic society that they are to be protected by the whole society. Otherwise, Krishna says in the first chapter, if not, then the destruction of society because of this lack of protection will be there. So that's one thing that Krishna mentions in the first chapter. Second thing, general instructions, is a very famous verse where he talks about one, in order to practice yoga, one should not sleep too much or sleep too little, eat too much, eat too little, not have any recreation or just too much recreation. In other words, Krishna is saying that the balance needs to be maintained in one's life, and this will create a suitable environment for one to practice yoga and to engage in meditation. So this is the first level of instruction that Krishna talks about. The second one is guya. The Sanskrit word that's used here is guya, and guya means secret. So there's a secret that Krishna reveals on the second level of instruction, that the soul is, and we get this particularly in the second chapter, the soul is distinct from the body. Patanjali mentions it also, makes a point of it in his Yoga Sutras. He talks about Prakriti, which the body is made out of. The body and the mind are made of Prakriti, material energy, earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and ego. And then Purusha, which is what Krishna says in the 7th chapter, and there is a superior energy, and that is called the Purusha, or the spiritual energy that the soul is made of. It's eternal, it's full of cognizance of one's position in eternality, and blissful. So this is the second level, and it's called Guya, or secret, by the great acharyas, the great spiritual teachers. And we get in Bhagavad Gita, the 2nd chapter, the 54th verse and the 47th verse, where Krishna mentions the distinction between matter and spirit, and how the soul is spiritual by nature. The third level is called Guyatar, and Guyatar means more secret. So first you have general instructions, then Krishna's level of instruction that is secret, and this secret can only be revealed when one is practicing yoga and connecting oneself to the true spiritual nature that is us. So this is the distinction between body and Brahman, matter and spirit. Third level, Guyatar, or more secret. There are two souls in the body, the self and the super soul. The super soul, Paramatma in Sanskrit. So the self, the jiva, is finite in nature. What is the distinction between God and the soul? Is that God is infinite and contains the characteristics, the primal characteristics of Satchit Ananda, or eternity, knowledge, and bliss. The soul is also Brahman, but it is distinct from the Supreme Soul, God, in that it is finite. So you have the vast ocean, and you have the ocean drop. So the ocean drop, there are innumerable ocean drops in the vast ocean. So within the extent of the creation of this material universe and universes, and throughout all the spiritual realm, there are innumerable souls. And these souls are finite, but contain also the characteristics, the attributes of Satchidananda. So in that way, we are one with the Supreme in terms of the qualitative nature. We are distinct, according to Bhagavad Gita, we're distinct from the Supreme Nature, the Supreme Soul, in that Jiva, or the soul, is finite. So quantitatively, there is distinction. Qualitatively, we are one. So it is correct to say we are one in a qualitative way, but we are distinct in a quantitative way. So God is infinite, the soul is finite. So this third level of instruction coming from Krishna reveals within every body and within every atom is the presence of the Supreme Soul called Paramatma. And in the 15th chapter, 15th verse of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna elaborates on that point. Sarvasya chaham ridi sanivishto matak smritir jnanam aponam cha. So within every living entity and in between and within every atom is the presence of this Supreme Soul. Sarvasya, all. Within the hearts of all living entities there. And from the presence of divinity, there is knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness. So even our ability to forget our true nature, that is coming from the Supreme Soul within the heart. When the soul so desires, there's reciprocation. Krishna says that also in the Bhagavad Gita. As you approach me, or as that you surrender yourself to me, there's reciprocation, there's reward. So even if the desire of the living entity is to forget about the Supreme Soul, the divinity that is beyond us and infinite by nature, then that ability to forget is also coming from the Supreme Personality of God. So that's the third level. And the fourth level is Guhyatam, or most secret. And this is what Krishna begins to reveal in the 7th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. 1 through 6, Krishna talks about Sankhya Yoga, which is another division or aspect of Jnana Yoga. So Jnana Yoga, Krishna talks extensively about in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th chapters about Karma Yoga. 6th chapter, another division of Jnana, which is called Jnana Yoga, which is called Dhyana Yoga, or the yoga of meditation. The whole 6th chapter pretty much talks about the mind, the nature of the mind, that the yogi needs to control the mind in order to engage in the yogic process, etc., etc. And at the end of the 6th chapter, after both karma and Jnana Yogas are discussed, then we come up to the Guhyatam, and that's the most secret, which is pure bhakti. Krishna begins to reveal the nature of bhakti, and we get that in the 9th chapter. And then the 5th level of instruction that's coming in Bhagavad Gita is Sarva Guhyatam, or the most secret of all secrets. That means pure bhakti with ras. That means with taste or flavor or mood, a very deep, profound spiritual mood that develops from execution of the principles of bhakti. So these 5 levels of instruction are there, and both 4 and 5 are here in the 9th chapter, as Krishna begins to reveal many things in the 9th chapter. That is of the Guhyatam and Sarva Guhyatam level of instruction, or most secret and the secret of all secrets, the most secret of all secrets. So I believe we left off at 10. Yeah, I think 10, chapter 9, text 10. This material nature, which is one of my energies, which is reiterated here. Krishna talks about the same thing in the 7th chapter when he talks about the material energy and what it's comprised of, and the spiritual energy and what it's comprised of. So here again, Krishna reiterates a very important point. This material nature, the earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and ego, is but one of my energies. It's working under my direction. And Krishna previously, I forget what chapter it is, third chapter, I believe, previously mentions that this material energy is my energy and it's very difficult to overcome. Meaning the effects or the influences that this material energy has on consciousness, when consciousness, meaning the soul, which emanates consciousness, comes in contact with the material energy, then what happens? There's influence. That's called the gunas, the ropes that bind us, and in the form of sattva gun, rajagun, and tamagun, or in terms of goodness, which is the characteristics of goodness are knowledge, light, happiness, peacefulness, etc. Those are the characteristics of goodness. Characteristics of rajagun, passion, that's distress, activity, lots of activity, and this way movement. And then tamagun, which is ignorance, which means sleep, indolence, etc. So these are influences that affect consciousness when it comes in contact. Because remember, the finiteness of the jiva, or the soul, puts it in a position where it can be influenced by another agency of Krishna, another energy of Krishna. So when that soul, that finite soul, albeit eternal, full of knowledge and bliss, comes in contact with this material energy, and due to its finiteness, is influenced by the effects of the material energy on it when it comes in contact with it, and enveloped by it, then those influences cause us to see, consciousness sees through the eyes of ego, a false identity, a false relationship with that material energy develops as a result of being influenced or contaminated by this energy, this material energy. So therefore Krishna is saying, this is one of my energies, and this energy works under my direction. It's not superior, or it cannot influence Krishna, because Krishna in his infiniteness emanates these energies, is the source of Prakriti, and is the source of the internal potency, the jiva, the spirit soul, and is the source of all these things. So he is transcendent to any of its influences. So it's acting under my direction, O son of Kunti, Arjuna, producing all moving and non-moving beings. So when we have the connection of Purusha or Jiva or soul with the material energy, and from that connection comes the creation of universes and all kinds of species, all kinds of bodies, etc. That's producing that connection is causing the jiva to have the covering of the material energy form in different ways that creates species. Under its rule, the rule of the material energy, this manifestation is created and annihilated again and again. So we have two distinct sets of laws, just like you have the gravitational law and so many different laws of nature. There's two separate and laws that spirit soul operates under. If it's in connection with Prakriti or the material energy, then it's under the laws of material energy, the laws of material nature. And that one of the dimensions of the laws of material nature is karma. So we are experiencing karma because we are covered by this energy, influenced by this energy. Consciousness is influenced in such a way that it acts under the laws of that energy, the material energy. And there's another set of rules for when that soul, in its journey back to its true nature, begins to elevate consciousness and purify consciousness to the point initially of understanding that there is a distinction. There are these two dimensions that we coexist in, the material energy and the spiritual energy. So when that is understood, when we become purified by execution of sadhana in yoga, our practice of yoga, and in bhakti yoga, the sadhana we've discussed many times, chanting and sadhu sangha, associating with elevated souls, and swadhyaya, the study of sacred texts, and the traveling to various holy places which are infused with spiritual energy and energy of purification. And then ultimately, within the scope of bhakti, there's certain rituals that are incorporated within our sadhana, or our practice, our regular routine, our exercise, in order to advance to the level of pure consciousness. Pure consciousness operates under different laws, and that's the laws which are directly governed by the Supreme. There is no intermediary in that regard. So this is something seriously to consider. We'll move on to text 11, rather. Krishna makes this point. He says, "Fools deride me when I descend in the human form. They do not know my transcendental nature as the Supreme Lord of all that be." So part of the influence of the material energy is to deride that there is a supreme being that is over all other living beings. So when it is discussed, like in Bhagavad Gita or in Bhagavad Purana, that the nature of the Supreme, the topmost nature of the Supreme, besides Brahman, its spiritual energy, and besides the manifestation of Paramatma, or Supersoul, within this material world, because Supersoul does not exist in the spiritual world. It's divinity in its incarnation in this material world to accompany the jiva here and to give jiva any and all opportunities for realization. So what Krishna is saying is, when someone hears that there is God, a personality, one that can interact with other souls and can perform play or pastimes, lila, then Krishna says here, foolish person will deride the existence of a Supreme Personality of Godhead. Text 12. Those who are thus bewildered are attracted by demoniac and atheistic views. In that deluded condition, their hopes for liberation, their fruitive activities, and their culture of knowledge are all defeated. So what happens when one is under the influence of the material energy, then Krishna says they're bewildered by that influence. And in that bewilderment, they are attracted to the notion of godlessness. Because our natural instinct or inclination is service. That is one of the manifestations, the active manifestations of love. So all of us have this inclination, especially when we are in love with our friends or our parents or our children or our beloved, when we have a loving relationship, the natural manifestation of that loving relationship is service, selfless service. And I've said this many times, that there are studies, research projects, both out of Harvard and Yale universities, Tufts University, which has established that people are happier giving than in receiving. So because it's natural to us. So when this service attitude is influenced by the nature, material nature, then the perversion of the service attitude is selfishness, because the service attitude in its purity, in its pure form, is selflessness. In other words, for the benefit of the Supreme and in relationship to all other living entities. That is the true nature of our love and our manifestation of love through service. So this service attitude, when it is utilized just to serve what we mistakenly perceive as the self, which means the senses and the mind. In other words, when we have as our priority, our action or our service is to ourself, to please ourself, and the nature or the relationship that the senses have with the objects of the senses, that outreach that is there, then that does not provide the santosh, or the contentment, or the fulfillment that the living entity is actually longing for. You see, no matter how one arranges its involvement in the material world, whether it's through acquisition of money or fame or strength or any one of these various acquisitions, we see that there is no real fulfillment. There may be a glimmer of happiness that will come from it, but happiness is described by Bhaktivinoda Thakur as coming on three levels. There's a level of happiness that one will experience when there's interaction between senses and sense objects. There's a higher level of happiness, Bhaktivinoda explains, when one comes in contact with its true spiritual nature. Na Brahmabhukta prasanatma na sochati na kamchati. Then there is relief from distress, and there's no anxiety, no distress. But then there is the third level of happiness, which comes when one manifests through purity the loving sentiment through service, that pure devotional service attitude that one manifests in relationship to the Supreme and all parts and parcels of the Supreme. And that is ultimately fulfilling, most fulfilling. So, so that's the explanation of 12. Number 13. O son of Pritha, those who are not deluded, the great souls. So herein Krishna uses the Sanskrit word Mahatma. You've probably heard of Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma means the great soul. So the great soul Gandhi. But Krishna here describes what is an actual great soul. Those who are free from the influence of the material energy which causes delusion. What is delusion? In a word or in a phrase, mistaking the body for the self. That is what delusion and what is being referred to as being under delusion. So those who are not under this delusion, the great souls, are under the protection of the divine nature. So I described that when we are under the influence of the material energy, we're under karma. We're under the laws of material nature. Karma, which has a very distinct purpose. And the distinct purpose of the laws of material energy is to bring us to the point of realization that we cannot have the degree and the level of fulfillment and enjoyment that we so desperately desire, so innately require. We don't have it. So when we actually begin to understand by our interaction with material energy, and by again and again being frustrated in our attempts for this ultimate satisfaction or contentment or fulfillment. So that is the purpose of the laws of the material energy, to bring us to that point of frustration. It's just like in society, when there is someone who is breaking the laws, those laws that you break, there are ramifications for breaking the law. If you break a law, then you can go to prison. And what's the stated purpose of prison? Is to rectify. Of course, it doesn't happen because the prison system is so corrupt, underfunded, and mismanaged in such a way that rather than it actually rectifying citizens, it in many instances hardens them. So in this regard, the material energy and its laws are meant to demonstrate to us that ultimately, the longer we continue to act under these laws, the less of a chance we will have for enjoyment within the scope of material energy. So it forces us into a state of mind of inquiry. Okay, if I cannot get from money what I really want, that real contentment, real satisfaction, if I cannot get it from fame, if I cannot get it by being strong or beautiful, then where do I get it? It brings us to the point of inquiry. And I think all of us here reach that point at some point in our life. What was the catalyst? Maybe different for different people, different strokes for different folks. But the catalyst, whatever it is, ultimately acting under the laws of material energy, the express purpose of the soul being put into that situation is to have the soul recognize that in a diluted condition, in connection with the material energy, in our attempts to exploit it and enjoy it, the ultimate satisfaction or fulfillment that the heart requires is just not there. And if it's not there, then we either become pessimists, or if we have sincerity, we begin our journey. We begin looking. I remember very clearly, it was during my college years when I had the realization that happiness won't come from a job, no matter what it is. The level of happiness that I was seeking, the contentment, the heartfelt level of happiness, then that propelled me in the direction of, searching out books and teachers that could actually illuminate my path. So that's the function, just to get beaten by the material energy, to try and frustrate it and try again and frustrate it, just missing that deep-seated contentment within the heart has its purpose. So what Krishna is saying here, the great souls are under the protection of the divine nature. So Krishna is indicating here that those who operate under the laws of God are actually protected by those laws and by one's interaction with the Supreme. They are fully engaged. So what's the result of not being deluded, being a great soul, and being under protection? They are fully engaged in devotional service. And that's literally bhakti. Because they know me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, original and inexhaustible. So foolishness comes in denial of that, and greatness comes in recognition of that, and acceptance and embracing that concept, that there is an original, inexhaustible, supreme personality of Godhead, and when we engage in relationship with that supreme, then there is reciprocation. That is bhakti. Reciprocation, availability, exchange, loving exchange. So Krishna says that's what that is indicative of consciousness becoming purified to the point of getting freer or more free from the deluded condition, the covering, or thinking that oneself is the body. 14. Very important sadhana verse is 14. Always chanting my glories, endeavoring with great determination, bowing down before me, these great souls perpetually worship me with devotion. So what is Krishna indicating here? That when an indication of one becoming free from the delusion, from bewilderment, then they engage in a sadhana. And who is the sadhana for? The sadhana is for the pleasure of the Supreme. So what is that sadhana? What's entailed within that sadhana? Always chanting the glories of the Lord. What does the narcissist do? Now, narcissist is kind of like the epitome of a self-centered person. And what does that person like to do in a narcissistic state? Yeah, person always likes to glorify oneself. Nothing is sweeter to such a person than the sound of one's own name. People talking about me. You look at Donald Trump, for instance. He always wants to be talked about. That is why he is such a glutton for coverage in the news. And for him, it really doesn't matter whether he gets negative coverage or positive coverage. There is such a strong self-centered desire to be recognized and glorified. See, that is the perversion of our true nature. Our true nature is to glorify. Our perverted nature is to be glorified. So Krishna says that the perfect practice of sadhana is when we're chanting. Always chanting what? Not our glories, but the glories of the Supreme. This is recognition, conscious recognition of the greatness of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We recognize that. And it's humbling. And in that humble state of mind, we can easily recognize, our position, our finiteness, instead of making the constant endeavor to put ourselves above everyone. That's a very hard and constant task, to always try to put ourselves above the rest, to establish ourselves. In fact, when one engages in putting down others, it's so that they can elevate themselves into a higher position. And that's why one of the symptoms of being freed from deluded condition is that there's no desire or enjoyment in talking about or criticizing others. Rumor mongering, untruthful statements, all of these things, criticism, like I said, all of these things, there's no satisfaction in that. Because one can understand, I'm a finite soul. One can point the mirror at oneself rather than always putting the mirror in front of everyone else and say, look at your faults. Look how faulty you are. One can now, as we become purified, as consciousness becomes purified, we can turn without fear, without trepidation. We can turn the mirror on ourselves and understand, how we are falling short, the recognition of our shortcomings. Oh, and what a recognition that is. People are afraid of that recognition. People think it's weak, but it's actually proof of strength and courage to recognize the faults within one's own heart, rather than to project those faults out onto others. Srila Prabhupada once said that when you are able to see and pinpoint certain faults in others, it's because you're so familiar with them. You have them in yourself. You're so familiar with those faults. So when you say, oh, that person is always criticizing others, it's because we're criticizing. We're involved in criticism. So in this way, these are the symptoms of the Mahatmas and the manifest symptoms of being not in a deluded condition. Always chanting my glories, endeavoring in service to the Supreme with great determination. Determination when it's under the influence of the material energy. A person can have great determination. Doesn't mean that you're only determined when you're engaged in spiritual sadhana. No, you can have determination to glorify yourself, to acquire for yourself. So Krishna says here, when you have the freedom, the purity, the ability to always chant, Satatam kirtayantomam. That's freedom is coming from freedom from the delusion of being in connection with the material energy and the misconception, living according to the misconception that we are our bodies and our minds and our intellect, rather than to understand the most important aspect, that we are soul, spirit soul, which emanates consciousness, motivates the material energy in the form of body. We begin to understand and act on that level. So that is a selflessness and determination. With that mindset means that we're determined to serve the Supreme and all of those engaged in service to the Supreme. It's a very selfless attitude and a joyful attitude. When we see how we look, how we can serve, what are the ways that we can serve others? Humanity, the great, the Mahatmas, and the Supreme. When we are always looking for opportunities for service in that regard, that's because we are becoming free from the bubble of delusion. So Krishna says, these great souls. They're humble. They perpetually worship me with devotion. All that we do becomes an offering. All that we offer is an offering of devotion to the Supreme. All the charity and our charitable disposition in relationship to the Supreme. All austerities that we may perform. Because people, any person that's a success, materially or otherwise, performs a lot of austerities in order to have that success. So, all austerities, if you perform austerities as an offering to the Supreme, then that is also freeing, it's liberating. So that's what Krishna says. These great souls perpetually worship me with devotion. Text 15. Others who engage in sacrifice by the cultivation of knowledge worship the Supreme Lord as the one without a second, as diverse in many and in the universal form. So the sacrifice of cultivation of knowledge of the Supreme, then once one has knowledge of the greatness of the Supreme, then one it is not difficult to worship the Supreme Lord because of that knowledge, that understanding of the greatness of the Lord, how all-pervasive, how that Supreme is always providing protection to the surrendered souls. These great souls, Mahatmas, who are perpetually worshiping with devotion. And Krishna says, worship the Supreme Lord as the one without a second, as diverse in many, seeing the presence of divinity within the hearts of all living entities. That's where compassion comes from. How is someone compassionate? Because one sees the value of life. And not only life in its essential form as the soul, but also as the divine form, the supersoul, seated within the heart of all living entities. So the Mahatma, the great soul, with clarity of vision, recognizes that in all living entities, whether it be bird or bee or tree or blade of grass or dog or cat or any animal species, lower and higher, and human beings, any color or culture, recognizing the oneness of all living entities, in that we are all living entities with a constitutional nature of Satchidananda, eternity, knowledge, and bliss, and predisposed to engage our charitable nature in service to the Supreme. We see with that equal vision, it's called the equal vision of the advanced soul, to see what is the value of all living entities. And therefore, Patanjali says nonviolence is an important, ahimsa is an important aspect or attribute to cultivate. And it becomes easy to cultivate a nonviolent mentality when we see that all living, and when we recognize through knowledge, through the cultivation of pure knowledge, when we recognize the nature of all living entities as essentially soul, part and parcel of the Supreme. So it becomes easy in that way to become compassionate and nonviolent. Text 16. But it is I who am the ritual. I, the sacrifice. This is Krishna speaking. The offering to the ancestors and the healing herb, the transcendental chant. I am the butter and the fire and the offering. So here Krishna is reiterating how you can recognize, because I am the ritual. So you're performing bhakti rituals. Krishna says, I am that ritual. So when you do the arti, to the Archa Vigraha form of Krishna, then even the performance of the ritual, Krishna says, I am that. I am the sacrifice. When we make sacrifice, the act of sacrifice, Krishna says, I am sacrifice. I am the offering to the ancestors. So Krishna is saying, whatever we do, we can see in relationship to the Supreme. 17, I am the father of this universe, the mother, the support, and the grandsire. I am the object of knowledge, the purifier, and the syllable Om. I am also the Rig, the Sama, and the Yajurvedas. 18, I am the goal, the sustainer, the master, the witness, the abode, the refuge, and the most dear friend. I am creation and the annihilation, the basis of everything, the resting place and the eternal seed. 19. O Arjuna, I give heat and I withhold and send forth the rain. I am immortality and I am also death personified. Both spirit and matter are in me. How does one attain fearlessness? True fearlessness comes in recognition of all these things, that even one does not fear death. Krishna says here, I am also death personified. And Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, when death happens and we are remembering, we are connected to the Supreme, then there's really no death, it's just transition. Death and the fear of death is because we don't know what's going to happen. But when one is imbued with knowledge of life and the termination of life, and then to be reborn, when one understands that cycle, there's not fear. And ultimately, as one's consciousness becomes more and more pure, then the recognition of the eternal loving relationship is there. And there's definitely no fear to be free from this mortal coil and engaged in our spiritual bodies in service with the Supreme. There's definitely no fear at that point. There's only remembrance and the joy of that remembrance. O Arjuna, I give heat, and I withhold and send forth the rain. Oh, I read that. 20, those who study the Vedas and drink the Soma juice, seeking the heavenly planets, worship me indirectly. So there are rituals that are performed to various demigods like Agni or Indra or Surya or Chandra, all the various demigods. There are different ritualistic performances, Durga, etc. All of these performances, ritualistic performances, are actually indirect offerings to the Supreme. Why? Because those offerings are accepted by the various personalities, and they in turn are offered to the Supreme. So we offer to those personalities, like Surya for health, Shiva for a partner, all these different demigods are approached for different reasons, for different pleasures or attainments of heavenly planets and heavenly enjoyment. And just a footnote, heaven, as used in the Bhagavad Gita, is different than the Judeo-Christian term heaven. In Judeo-Christian version, heaven is where God is. In the Vedic understanding, there are 14 planetary systems within the universe. And the upper planetary systems like Satyalok, Swargaloka, and those higher planetary systems, they are considered heavenly planets. Why? Because there's a higher standard of enjoyment, there is a greater lifespan, and depending on which of those heavenly planets one attains to, there is really not much suffering that's there at all. So in this way, when you hear the term heaven, attainment of heaven, it's not in what is being understood in the Judeo-Christian term. Heaven means God's abode. It's not what's being referred to. It's still within the material realm, and still there is birth and death and old age, and very little, but also disease. There's still those manifestations within the heavenly planets. It's just a higher standard of enjoyment. So in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says in the 7th chapter that if you want to develop faith, in other words, all of these things that are outlined in the Vedas, there is a progression. If you don't believe that there is a God, a supreme personality of God, we should serve that personality with all of our heart and all of our being, then what you can do is perform Vedic rituals to various personalities in exchange for rewards. And when one sees that those rewards are forthcoming as a result, then one gains faith in the Vedic ritualistic performances. So when the tantric performance rituals of bhakti, like deity worship and that, when one has faith that these performances of the various rituals are meant for my purification, then one can see the value in performance of it in service to the Supreme. So just wanted to make that heavenly distinction between heaven as used in the Judeo-Christian terminology as opposed to the Vedic terminology. So they attain the heavenly planets. They are still worshiping me indirectly. Purify of sinful reactions, because actually in order to do those ritualistic performances, there's a certain lifestyle, more sattvic lifestyle that one must lead. So that means there's a cultivation of a purified intelligence, which leads one away from actions which cause further bondage, and more of a developed inclination towards sattvic activities, good activities that are in goodness, that are full of knowledge, clarity, peace, and joy. Purify of these sinful reactions, they take birth on the pious heavenly planets of Indra, where they enjoy godly delights. 21. When they have thus enjoyed vast heavenly sense pleasures, and the results of their pious activities are exhausted, they return to this mortal planet again. Thus those who seek sense enjoyment by adhering to the principles of the 3 Vedas achieve only repeated birth and death. So you do attain a higher standard of enjoyment, but it does not free you from the laws of material nature, which cause repeated birth and death. So I will stop there. We will continue next week, I believe. I'm leaving tomorrow for the Gita Nagari Eco Farm. My son and I are going. There's a kids camp there. So my son will be with about 50 other kids. And they'll be doing kirtan and all kinds of things. Water sports and kirtan, so many different things. So we're going tomorrow. And I think from the Gita Nagari area, I can do a Zoom presentation. So I'm planning to be on Zoom next week, next Wednesday. So again, thank you all for taking the time to be with me this evening. If anyone has any question or comment or realization, observation, please feel free to raise your hand or speak up. That would be greatly appreciated by all, I'm sure. Anyone? Okay. All right. If there are no questions or comments, thank you very much for joining me this evening, and we'll see you next week. Until that time, have a happy, healthy, and holy week ahead of you. We'll talk to you from Gita Nagari, where you'll probably hear the mooing of the cows in the background. Till next Wednesday, Hare Krishna.